In the great hall of the alien palace, the princess stood tall, her golden armor gleaming under the flickering light of the torches. The room was filled with the sound of laughter as the alien warriors looked on, their eyes focused on the human who had dared to challenge their princes. He was a soldier, young and small by their standards. His clothes were simple, a faded uniform with no signs of power or strength. His name was Thomas, and though he was far from a warrior in their eyes, he had something none of them expected: courage. The princess, an alien being of unimaginable beauty and strength, stepped forward with a smirk on her lips. Her dark purple skin shimmered like a galaxy, and her silver hair fell like a waterfall over her shoulders. She was known throughout the galaxy for her deadly skills in battle. No one, not even the strongest of warriors, dared to challenge her. But now before her stood a human, a species she thought of as weak. She looked down at his sword, a basic weapon by their standards, and her lips curled into a mocking smile. "You call that a sword?" she said, her voice rich with amusement. "It's nothing compared to the weapons of my people. I doubt you can even lift it properly." The room went silent, every eye on Thomas. The princess's words stung, and the warriors around them chuckled, their laughter echoing off the stone walls. But Thomas didn't back down. His jaw clenched, and his blue eyes burned with a quiet fire. He stood tall, refusing to let her mock him. He may not have had the strength of the alien warriors, but he had something that they lacked: determination. "You may think your weapons are stronger, but strength isn't everything," Thomas said, his voice steady. "I'll show you that a true warrior isn't measured by the size of his sword." The princess's eyes narrowed, her amusement turning into something darker. She had never met a human who spoke like this before. She had dealt with many beings, from powerful aliens to savage beasts, but none had ever dared to stand up to her like this. "Very well," she said, her voice laced with a challenge. "You want to prove something? Then we'll settle this in the old way, by combat." Murmur ran through the room. The warriors were eager to see this human humiliated. The princess was undefeated, and they believed no one could challenge her. But Thomas didn't hesitate. His heart raced with anticipation, but his face remained calm. The princess motioned for the duel to begin. She stepped back, her eyes glowing with intensity as she gripped her weapon, a beautiful shimmering blade that seemed to hum with energy. It was a weapon forged by her people, capable of cutting through steel like butter. Thomas, on the other hand, had only his sword, a simple, unremarkable piece of metal. But he had something the princess hadn't counted on: his mind, his skills, and his willpower. The two stood in silence, the air thick with tension. The warriors watched eagerly, their breaths held in anticipation. The battle would soon begin, and no one knew what to expect. The princess moved first, her blade flashing like lightning as she swung at Thomas with incredible speed. The room gasped, thinking that he wouldn't be able to keep up, but Thomas was quick on his feet. He ducked and dodged, narrowly avoiding the princess's strikes. His heart pounded in his chest, but he remained focused, his eyes locked on her every move. For a moment, it seemed as though he was nothing more than a blur, dancing around the princess's powerful strikes. The warriors watched in awe as the human evaded each attack with skill and precision. But the princess wasn't finished yet. She raised her blade high, preparing for a powerful overhead strike. The force behind it could have shattered the ground beneath them, but Thomas didn't flinch. Instead, he took a step forward and brought his sword up to meet hers. The clash was deafening, the sound of metal against metal ringing through the hall. For a moment, time seemed to stand still. The human sword vibrated under the force of the princess's strike, but it didn't break. He held his ground. The warriors gasped. This was no ordinary human. This was a fighter, someone who had been trained to survive against all odds. The princess, her face now showing a hint of frustration, pushed harder. She swung again and again, each strike faster than the last. But Thomas didn't give in. His movements were swift and calculated. He wasn't just fighting for survival. He was fighting to prove that he wasn't as weak as they all believed. With each clash of their swords, the room grew more silent. The warriors no longer laughed. They were watching with rapt attention, unsure of what was happening. Could this human actually defeat the princess? Could he truly stand against someone who had never known defeat? As the battle continued, it became clear that this wasn't going to be a simple fight. The human had something the princess hadn't expected: heart. And with every strike, every dodge, he was proving that a warrior's true strength didn't come from the size of his sword, but from the power inside. The room fell silent, and for the first time, the princess was unsure of the outcome. And as the fight raged on, no one could have predicted what would happen next. Asterisk. The tension in the air was palpable, every eye in the room locked on the two fighters. Thomas stood firm, his sword gripped tightly in his hands. The princess, her face a mixture of irritation and intrigue, readied her blade. The audience held its collective breath. No one had ever seen the princess struggle before. Now, for the first time, there was uncertainty in her eyes. The princess made the first move, a lightning-fast slash aimed at Thomas's chest. She was a blur of grace and power, her blade cutting through the air with an ease that made her seem like a force of nature. Thomas barely had time to react, but he knew one thing for sure: if he hesitated, he would lose. He sidestepped just in time, the blade missing him by mere inches. The sound of the princess's weapon cutting through the air echoed in his ears, reminding him of how close he had come to defeat. Sweat dripped down his forehead, but his resolve only strengthened. He couldn't afford to let up, not now, not when he had the chance to prove himself. With a grunt, he launched forward, swinging his sword in a wide arc. The princess parried effortlessly, her strength sending his sword clanging to the side. Thomas stumbled back, regaining his footing just in time to avoid another powerful blow. The crowd gasped, unsure of how this human was able to keep up with their princess. The princess's eyes flashed with anger, her pride wounded. No one had ever been able to outlast her in a duel, much less a mere human. She had underestimated him, and now she was paying the price. "You're more skilled than I thought," she spat, her voice cold. "But that won't save you." Without warning, she launched herself at him, her speed unmatched. Her strikes came so fast that Thomas could barely keep up. Each blow was like a crashing wave, relentless and unforgiving. He was forced into a defensive stance, blocking and dodging, his arms aching from the effort, but he didn't back down. With each block, Thomas was learning. He was feeling the rhythm of her attacks, understanding her moves. The princess's strength was immense, but it was predictable. And as he deflected another strike, something in him clicked. He wasn't just fighting for survival anymore. He was fighting to win. He ducked low, letting the princess's sword sweep overhead. In that instant, he saw his chance. With a swift movement, he surged forward, his sword aimed directly at her side. The princess's eyes widened as she saw the human's blade coming at her. She twisted at the last moment, narrowly avoiding the strike. But the force of his move pushed her back, and for the first time, she faltered. The crowd gasped, a ripple of shock running through the onlookers. Could it be? Could this human actually have the upper hand? The princess's breathing became heavier, a slight sheen of sweat on her brow. This was no longer a fight for sport. This was a fight for survival. She was starting to realize that Thomas wasn't just a skilled fighter. He had the determination to win, and that made him dangerous. Her pride, once unshakable, began to crack. She had underestimated the human's heart, his unwavering resolve to fight. And as they continued to clash, the princess realized something else. Thomas wasn't fighting like a soldier. He was fighting like someone who had nothing to lose. For a brief moment, time seemed to stretch. The sounds of clashing swords faded into the background as the two locked eyes, both of them testing each other's will. The princess, so used to dominating her opponents, was now facing a warrior who refused to bend. Her mind raced as she tried to find a way to break him. But there was something in Thomas's gaze, something fierce, something unyielding that told her he would not be so easily defeated. With a sharp breath, the princess snapped back into focus. She couldn't let this human embarrass her. She was the strongest warrior in the galaxy, and she would not be bested by someone who had no place in this battle. She stepped back, gathering her energy for the next strike. But Thomas wasn't finished yet. Before she could make her move, he rushed forward again, this time faster and more precise. His sword became a blur, each swing calculated and determined. She blocked, but her arms were starting to feel the strain. The princess, for the first time, was starting to sweat. And then, with a roar of frustration, she launched herself at him, using her full strength. Her blade swung down with the force of a falling star, aimed straight for Thomas's head. Thomas barely had time to react. He raised his sword in a last-ditch effort to block, but the power behind her strike was immense. The impact sent him flying backward, crashing into the stone wall of the hall. The crowd held its breath as Thomas hit the ground hard. For a moment, there was silence, but then something extraordinary happened. Slowly, painfully, Thomas stood. His sword still clutched in his hand, his eyes locked on the princess. His chest heaved with each breath, but his will was stronger than ever. He wasn't done. Not by a long shot. The princess stared at him, her breath coming in sharp gasps. For the first time, she felt a flicker of doubt. This human wasn't like the others. He wasn't just fighting for survival, he was fighting for something greater. And that, more than anything, made him a formidable opponent. The duel had just begun, and the outcome was far from certain. The room was still, save for the sound of heavy breathing. Thomas stood in the center of the battlefield, his sword trembling slightly in his hands, eyes burning with determination. The princess, once brimming with confidence, now regarded him with a flicker of wariness. Her elegant armor was scratched and stained with sweat, her once perfect composure beginning to falter. She had underestimated him, something that had never happened before. And now she wasn't sure what to make of the human in front of her. For a brief moment, they both paused, standing at opposite ends of the stone hall. The crowd, once laughing at the human's audacity, now watched with bated breath. The fight had shifted in an unpredictable direction, and no one knew how it would end. The princess's grip tightened on her weapon. She had to finish this. She couldn't allow herself to be bested by someone so beneath her. She was the proud heir to an ancient lineage, the fiercest warrior of her kind. Her blade shimmered with an ethereal glow, pulsating with a power only her people could wield. With a growl, she lunged forward again, her blade cutting through the air faster than the eye could follow. But this time, Thomas didn't retreat. He stepped into the attack, raising his sword to meet hers. The clash was deafening, and the ground beneath them seemed to shake with the force. However, something had changed. As their blades met, there was an odd hum, a strange vibration that ran through the air. It wasn't from the princess's weapon. It came from Thomas's sword. The princess's eyes widened as the sword began to glow, a soft golden light that seemed to grow stronger with each passing second. She stepped back, her brow furrowing in confusion. The glow was unnatural, almost alien, and it was coming from the human's weapon. "What is this?" she hissed, her voice a mix of disbelief and frustration. "How is this possible?" Thomas didn't answer. Instead, he allowed the power to surge through him, a force he had never felt before. It wasn't from the sword itself, not truly. It was something within him, something deep inside, buried beneath years of struggle and pain. He had always known there was something different about him, something that set him apart from other humans. But now, in the heat of battle, it was awakening. He gripped the hilt of his sword tighter, and the energy intensified. It wasn't just raw power, it was something ancient, something tied to his very blood. The sword had been forged by his ancestors, long before the first contact with the alien species. It was a relic, an artifact imbued with a power no one had expected humanity to possess. The princess stumbled back as the force from his blade sent a shockwave through the room. The glow was growing brighter, nearly blinding in its intensity. The ground beneath them began to crack, small fissures appearing in the stone. The warriors around them backed away in fear, their eyes wide with uncertainty. This was no ordinary battle anymore. For the first time, the princess felt a real sense of danger. She had fought countless beings, alien and human alike, but nothing like this. Thomas wasn't just a skilled fighter. He was channeling something greater, something primal and powerful. It wasn't just his skill that made him a threat. It was the power that had lain dormant inside him all along. The human sword hummed with an energy that seemed to match the rhythm of his heartbeat. Thomas was no longer the scared soldier, trying to prove himself. He was something more, something far beyond his wildest dreams. His mind raced as he focused on the energy flowing through him, the ancient power that connected him to something much older than he had ever imagined. He lifted his sword higher, and with a mighty swing, he sent a burst of energy through the air. The princess barely had time to react as the blast struck her, sending her sprawling backward. The impact was so intense, it felt like the entire hall had been struck by a thunderstorm. For a moment, everything was silent. The princess lay on the ground, her breath coming in ragged gasps. She had never been knocked off her feet like this, not even in the fiercest of battles. Slowly, she pushed herself up, her body aching from the force of the blow. Her eyes locked onto Thomas, now standing tall, his sword glowing brighter than ever. She could feel the heat radiating from him, the raw power that surged through his veins. It was unlike anything she had ever encountered. He wasn't just a human, he was a force of nature, and she had no idea how far that power could reach. Thomas stood there, his chest heaving, his eyes filled with something new confidence. This was no longer just about survival. This was about showing the universe that humanity had something to offer. They weren't weak, and they certainly weren't to be underestimated. He had the strength, the skill, and now the power to back it up. "I told you," he said, his voice calm yet full of purpose. "It's not the sword that makes the warrior. It's what's inside." The princess's gaze darkened. She had underestimated him. And now she had to admit something she hadn't in years. She was afraid. The battle was far from over. But, for the first time, the princess wasn't sure if she would win. Thomas had just revealed a power that shook the very foundation of everything she had known. The air crackled with tension, thick with the residue of power that had just been unleashed. Thomas stood at the center of the battlefield, his breath steady but his heart racing. His sword, glowing brighter than before, hummed with an energy that seemed to pulse in rhythm with his own heartbeat. It wasn't just a weapon anymore, it was a key to something far greater, something that had always been within him. The princess, her body still aching from the force of the blast, slowly rose to her feet. Her golden armor was scratched and scorched, her once imposing presence now wavering. She was no longer the supreme being she had once believed herself to be. For the first time, she found herself questioning her own power. She met Thomas's eyes, and for the first time since their duel began, she wasn't just facing an opponent. She was facing someone who had something she didn't, something deep inside him, something elemental. Her mind raced as she tried to make sense of it. How could this human possess such power? "What are you?" she breathed, her voice laced with awe and confusion. She had faced gods, warlords, and conquerors from across the galaxy, but nothing prepared her for this moment. The human who had stood before her with nothing more than a sword now stood as an enigma, radiating a force she couldn't comprehend, Thomas's lips curled into a small smile, though it was tinged with exhaustion. He had been holding back, but now he knew he couldn't anymore. The battle wasn't just for his survival, it was for the future of his people. The sword in his hand, the ancient weapon, had chosen him for a reason. And it was more than just a relic, it was a conduit to something greater. "You may not understand," he said, his voice steady, "but this power isn't just mine. It belongs to all of us, my ancestors, my people, my history. This sword, this power is humanity's gift to the galaxy." The princess's eyes narrowed. Her mind spun with the implications of his words. She had known humans were resourceful, cunning, and strong in ways that could never be quantified by physical might. But this was beyond anything she had ever imagined. He wasn't just a human. He was the embodiment of something she had never given them credit for, the strength of a species with a deep, hidden potential. "You're saying this sword, it's from your people?" she asked, her voice faltering for the first time. "From humans?" Thomas nodded slowly. He could see the disbelief in her eyes, the realization dawning on her like a cold shadow. She had always viewed humanity as weak, primitive, and beneath her. But in that moment, Thomas saw something change in her, something raw, something that spoke to the core of who she was. "You don't know the full history," he said, his eyes darkening with the weight of unspoken stories. "Humanity was once far more powerful than anyone realized. Our ancestors fought wars, built civilizations, and created weapons like this one long before we met your kind. But over time, we lost that power, buried it under the weight of progress. We've forgotten what we once were." The princess remained silent, her eyes locked on his sword, which still glowed with a golden brilliance. For a moment, she simply stared at him, the pieces falling into place. The power he wielded wasn't just physical, it was something ancient, something tied to a forgotten era. And now, it was being resurrected. But the princess couldn't afford to be overwhelmed by his revelation. She couldn't let herself be shaken, not in front of her warriors, not in front of the galaxy. She was the proud heir to an ancient dynasty, the fiercest fighter of her kind. She would not be defeated by a human, no matter the power he wielded. "I don't care who gave you that power," she said, her voice hardening. "You're still just a human, and I will defeat you." Her sword crackled with energy as she charged again, this time with a fury that was almost unrecognizable. The princess, once calm and composed, now seemed consumed by rage. She swung her blade with a speed and force that could have shattered entire cities. Thomas raised his sword to meet hers, his golden blade glowing even brighter, almost as though it was responding to the challenge. But as their swords clashed once more, something unexpected happened. For the first time, Thomas felt the full weight of the sword's power flood through him. It wasn't just a weapon anymore. It was a living force, an extension of his own will. The energy coursed through his veins, amplifying every move, every thought. He was no longer just a man with a sword. He was something more. As he pressed forward, he could feel the princess's strength beginning to waver. Her attacks, though still powerful, lacked the precision they once had. She was fighting with everything she had, but she was no longer fighting a mere human. She was fighting an ancient power that she couldn't begin to understand. Thomas's heart raced as he pushed forward, his movements becoming more fluid, more natural. The sword was guiding him now, urging him to act with purpose and confidence. For the first time in his life, he understood the true meaning of the word strength. With one final decisive strike, he pushed the princess's blade aside and sent a burst of energy from his sword directly into the ground beneath them. The entire hall trembled as the shockwave sent ripples through the stone floor, knocking the princess off balance and sending her crashing to the ground. She lay there, stunned, her chest heaving as she tried to catch her breath. For a moment, everything was still. The princess's eyes, wide with shock, met Thomas's, and she realized, deep down, that this battle had already been decided. Thomas stood above her, his sword glowing brighter than ever, the power of his ancestors flowing through him. He had proven that humanity wasn't weak, that, against all odds, they could stand tall. But the princess wasn't finished yet. For the first time in her life, she had been defeated not by strength, but by something much deeper. And though she lay on the ground, gasping for air, a part of her began to wonder, if humanity had this much power, what else were they capable of? The hall was silent, the only sound the distant hum of energy radiating from Thomas's sword. The princess lay on the cold stone floor, breathing heavily, her body battered and bruised from the intensity of their duel. She had never been struck like this before, not by any alien, not by any other warrior. She had been knocked down, but she was not defeated. Not yet. As Thomas stood over her, sword raised, the room seemed to close in on them. His golden blade flickered with an eerie light, the energy from it now pulsing with purpose. It wasn't just power, it was a promise. A promise that humanity was no longer the weak species others believed them to be. The princess slowly pushed herself up, eyes narrowed, sweat dripping down her face. She had underestimated him, yes. But now she was beginning to understand something she hadn't before. It wasn't just about strength, it was about willpower. And Thomas had more willpower than any opponent she had ever faced. "You've earned my respect, human," she said, her voice hoarse. "But this battle isn't over yet." Thomas's grip on his sword tightened, but he did not lower it. He had come this far. There was no turning back now. He had already shown her humanity's strength, but now he would show her something even more powerful, humanity's resolve. The princess raised her own blade, her eyes burning with determination. "If you think you've won, you're mistaken. I will not be so easily defeated." The air grew thick with the tension of an impending storm. The warriors around them, who had been watching in stunned silence, now murmured among themselves. They had seen their princess face many enemies, but none had pushed her this far. None had made her doubt herself. And that made this moment unforgettable. With a growl, the princess surged forward once again. Her movements were swift, almost a blur, as she brought her blade down toward Thomas. But this time, Thomas was ready. He stepped aside, his sword slicing through the air to meet hers with a crackling force. The battle had shifted. Thomas was no longer merely fighting to survive. He was fighting to win, and more than that, he was fighting for humanity. For everyone who had ever been looked down upon, underestimated, or discarded as weak. This was his moment to prove that humanity could stand shoulder to shoulder with any species in the galaxy. The princess's strikes came faster now, each one fueled by frustration and pride. But with every strike, Thomas grew stronger. The energy from his sword, once a flicker, was now a roaring blaze, guiding him, empowering him. It was as though the sword itself had become an extension of his will. She swung her blade in a wide arc, aiming to overwhelm him with sheer force. But Thomas did not retreat. Instead, he pivoted, bringing his sword up to meet hers in a dazzling flash of light. The force of their blades crashing together sent a shockwave through the room, knocking everyone back several paces. The princess staggered, her feet sliding on the stone floor. She had underestimated the power of the sword once more. But Thomas had not underestimated her. He knew she was strong, perhaps stronger than anyone he had ever faced. But now he was fighting with something more. He was fighting for the future of his people, for every human who had ever been dismissed or overlooked. He pressed forward, his sword moving with deadly precision. The princess, though still formidable, was beginning to slow. Her strikes lacked the same fire they had before. Her pride, once her greatest weapon, was now her greatest weakness. With one final, powerful thrust, Thomas drove his sword through the air. The princess blocked, but she was too slow. His blade struck hers with an explosion of light, sending her sword flying from her grasp. She staggered back, her knees buckling beneath her as she fell to the floor. For a moment, the room was still. The princess lay there, breathless, her eyes wide with disbelief. She had been defeated. Not by a weapon, not by strength, but by the spirit of a human who refused to give up. Thomas stood over her, his chest heaving with exhaustion, his sword still glowing brightly. He had done it. He had proven that humanity was more than just a species to be dismissed. He had shown them all that humans were capable of greatness. The princess slowly raised her head, her eyes meeting his. There was no anger in them, now only respect. "You've won," she said, her voice soft, almost unrecognizable. "You've proven humanity's strength. But remember this victory is only the beginning. The galaxy will not forget what you've done here today." Thomas nodded, his face a mixture of triumph and exhaustion. He had won the battle, but the war for humanity's place in the galaxy was far from over. There were still many challenges ahead, many battles to fight. But for the first time in history, humanity had proven that they were not weak, they were not inferior. They were a force to be reckoned with. And as Thomas stood there, sword in hand, the princess's words echoed in his mind. This victory is only the beginning. The journey ahead would be long and hard, but he was ready. Ready to face whatever came next, for humanity had finally found its place among the stars. The silence in the hall was suffocating, broken only by the faint hum of energy still emanating from Thomas's sword. He stood tall, his chest heaving with exertion, the weight of the battle heavy on his shoulders. His eyes, however, burned with a quiet intensity. The duel with the princess had ended, and he had emerged victorious. But as he stood there, sword in hand, something felt different. Something was shifting in the air. The princess, still kneeling on the floor, was no longer the proud and unbeatable warrior she once was. She looked up at him, eyes filled with a mixture of awe and disbelief. For the first time in her life, she felt the sting of defeat. But there was something more, something that made her heart race in a way she couldn't understand. It wasn't fear, though it came close. It was a realization that Thomas had not just won a duel. He had broken an ancient order, shattered centuries of arrogance and superiority. And the galaxy was watching. But before she could say another word, the entire hall suddenly trembled. A low rumble echoed from deep beneath the ground, growing louder with each passing second. The lights flickered, casting strange, shifting shadows across the stone walls. The air grew thick, charged with an energy that felt both familiar and foreign to Thomas. He had felt something like it before, but this time, it was different, stronger, more insistent. The princess, still on the floor, looked up sharply. Her eyes widened in recognition, and for the first time since their duel began, genuine fear flashed across her face. "No," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Before she could react, the floor beneath them cracked, sending a shockwave through the hall. The warriors surrounding them scrambled to find balance, their faces filled with confusion and panic. Thomas's heart skipped a beat. This wasn't just a tremor. This was something much more dangerous. A bright light filled the room, blinding him for a moment. When his vision cleared, his eyes locked onto a shape in the distance. A massive shadow appeared at the far end of the hall, growing larger with every passing second. The walls seemed to ripple as if reality itself was bending. And then, through the light and smoke, a figure emerged. It was unlike anything Thomas had ever seen before. It was tall, far taller than any creature he had encountered, and it exuded a strange, otherworldly energy. Its skin shimmered like liquid metal, reflecting the light in impossible ways. It moved with a grace that belied its immense size, its presence filling the room with an overwhelming force. The warriors who had once feared the princess now turned in terror. They recognized the figure at once, the exiled one of... The soldiers muttered, his voice trembling. The one who was banished. The princess's expression hardened as she stood, her eyes never leaving the towering figure. Her face, though still bruised from their fight, betrayed a deep sense of dread. "How did they find us?" she whispered under her breath, more to herself than to anyone else. Thomas's mind raced. The exiled one? Who was this being? What did it want? And why did the princess seem so terrified? Before he could ask any of these questions, the massive figure stepped forward, the ground shaking beneath its feet with every movement. The air grew heavier, more suffocating, as if the very atmosphere was bending under the weight of its presence. The warriors around him backed away, unwilling to face the unstoppable force that had just appeared. The exiled one's voice rang out, low and resonant, filling the hall with a deep vibration that rattled Thomas's bones. "You have awakened the power that should have remained dormant, human," it said, its voice like the rumble of thunder. "And now the consequences will be severe." Thomas felt a cold chill run down his spine. Whatever this being was, it was not something he could fight. Not with mere strength or skill, at least. This was a force of nature. The power it radiated was suffocating, an ancient and overwhelming force. The princess stepped forward, her eyes narrowing as she stared at the exiled one. "I warned you," she said, her voice tight with frustration and fear. "You didn't. Listen, now we must face the wrath of the ancients." Thomas's grip tightened on his sword, his mind racing. The ancients? He could sense the weight of the situation. This was bigger than just a personal duel. This was about something far more dangerous, something that could threaten the entire galaxy. And he had just unwittingly triggered it. The exiled one's eyes, if they could even be called eyes, glowed with an unnatural light. "You will not survive this, human. You are a small spark in the grand scheme of the universe, and now you have attracted the attention of forces beyond your understanding. Your fight was never meant to be here. You were never meant to awaken what you did." The princess, her fists clenched, turned to Thomas. "You don't understand," she said, her voice low and urgent. "The sword you wield isn't just a relic, it's a key. A key to something far darker than you can imagine. And by using it, you've opened a door that should have remained closed." Thomas's eyes widened. "What are you talking about? What door?" But before she could answer, the exiled one took another step forward. The energy in the room surged with a new intensity, the light around them pulsing with a rhythm that felt like a countdown. "This will be the end of your story, human," the exiled one declared, raising one massive arm toward Thomas. A dark energy began to form around the exiled one's hand, swirling like a storm. The air seemed to crackle with a power so immense that Thomas could barely comprehend it. The sword in his hand hummed, reacting to the growing threat, but it was clear that the power in front of him was something far beyond anything he had faced. And then, in a flash of blinding light, everything went black. The room was bathed in darkness, the air crackling with the weight of the exiled one's presence. Thomas stood frozen, the cold grip of fear tightening around his chest. The golden sword in his hand still hummed with energy, but it felt insignificant. Now, against this unimaginable force, he was just a man, a small fleeting presence in the face of something ancient and beyond his understanding. The exiled one's enormous form towered over them, its eyes glowing with an eerie, unsettling light. Every movement it made sent waves of energy through the room, distorting the very air around them. The ground beneath their feet trembled, as though the very foundations of the palace were giving way to the weight of the being before them. "This is the reckoning," the exiled one intoned, its voice reverberating through the hall like the sound of distant thunder. "You have awakened the long-slumbering forces of the cosmos, human. The key you wield has opened the door to your destruction. Thomas felt his heart race, the adrenaline surging through him. His mind was spinning, unable to keep up with the enormity of what was happening. The princess had spoken of a key, a weapon that was more than just a sword. He hadn't understood the true significance of it until now. He had unleashed something ancient, something terrifying. The princess, standing beside him, looked pale, her eyes wide with dread. Her earlier arrogance had completely evaporated, replaced with a fear that Thomas had never seen from her. The princess who had once mocked him now looked to him for answers, but he had none. "What are we supposed to do now?" Thomas asked, his voice barely a whisper. He couldn't take his eyes off the exiled one. It was like staring into the abyss. Princess swallowed hard, her expression hardening as she stepped forward. "We fight," she said, her voice steady but filled with urgency. "We have no choice. The ancients won't allow us to escape this." The exiled one's laugh boomed through the hall, a deep, echoing sound that sent chills down Thomas's spine. "Fight? You think you can stand against the forces that control the very fabric of the universe? You are nothing. Your will is a fleeting thing, and your strength is a whisper in the void." Thomas gripped his sword tightly, his knuckles turning white. The princess was right. They had no choice. But the power that was surging from the exiled one was unlike anything he had ever encountered. It wasn't just strength, it was control. Over the very essence of the world around them. He could feel it, an overwhelming pressure, like being in the eye of a storm. Then, something unexpected happened. The sword in Thomas's hand pulsed once more, sending a shockwave through his body. The golden light intensified, brighter than it had ever been before. It was as though the sword was alive, reacting to something deep within him, something he had never fully understood until now. His heart began to race, his thoughts narrowing to one singular truth. He wasn't fighting alone. The sword, with all its power, was a part of him. It had been waiting, choosing this moment to fully awaken. The energy flowing through him was ancient, yes, but it was also new. It was something he had unlocked, something born from humanity's deepest instincts and forgotten history. It wasn't just an artifact, it was a beacon, a bridge between his species and the unknown. "Whatever you are," Thomas shouted, his voice shaking but growing stronger with each word, "we are humanity, and we will not bow to you." The exiled one's glowing eyes narrowed. "You believe your spirit will protect you? You are too weak to understand what you face. This is not just a fight for survival, it is the reckoning of your kind." Without warning, the exiled one raised its hand, and the air thickened with energy. A bolt of pure dark energy shot toward Thomas, its speed faster than he could react. The princess screamed, but in that moment, everything slowed down. Instinctively, Thomas raised his sword. The golden light erupted in a brilliant flash meeting the dark energy in a violent explosion that shook the room to its core. For a moment, all he could hear was the deafening roar of energy crashing against energy. The shockwave sent him stumbling back, but he held his ground, eyes locked onto the exiled one. The exiled one recoiled, its form flickering for a moment before it regained its composure. "Impossible," it hissed, its voice laced with rage. "You cannot defeat me. I am the embodiment of the forgotten force. I am the end of all things." Thomas stood taller now, the golden sword crackling with raw, untapped energy. He felt something stir within him, a power that he had never known existed, but now surged within his veins like fire. This wasn't just the sword, it was humanity's spirit, unbroken and fierce, reaching beyond what the exiled one had ever imagined. The princess, her confidence restored by his resilience, stepped forward as well. "We're not just humans," she said, her voice unwavering. "We are fighters. We've survived for centuries, even against the darkest of odds, and we will survive this." The exiled one's eyes burned with hatred as it raised both hands. But this time, it hesitated, a flicker of doubt crossing its vast, ancient mind. For the first time, it could feel it, the power of humanity, the indomitable will, the stubbornness to stand in the face of extinction. It roared in fury, unleashing a torrent of energy toward them. But Thomas didn't falter. He raised his sword, its light now blinding in its intensity. "Humanity will stand," he shouted. The blade met the dark force once more, and this time the golden light overwhelmed it, piercing through the exiled one's energy with a blinding flash. The exiled one screamed, a sound that echoed through the halls, before its form shattered into a million pieces, its energy dissipating into the air like dust caught in a cosmic wind. And then, silence. The hall was still, the oppressive energy that had once filled the air now gone. Thomas stood there, breathless and exhausted, his sword still glowing faintly. He glanced at the princess, who was also panting, but her eyes were filled with awe and something else, gratitude. For the first time, she spoke not as a queen, but as an equal. "You did it," she said, her voice quiet but full of wonder. "You and humanity, you're not just survivors. You're more powerful than anyone could have imagined." Thomas nodded slowly. "We're more than you think, and this is just the beginning." The room was still, but the weight of what had just happened hung in the air like a promise. Humanity's place in the galaxy had just been secured. And the future? The future was theirs to shape.